What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Tuesdays, 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern, on Pacifica affiliates WXOJ-LP-FM, Northampton, Massachusetts, and KWMD in Kasilof and Anchorage, Alaska. Produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, streaming, podcasting, and archived at madnessradio.net. Thanks for joining us today on Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall. Today, my guest is Alison Bass. Alison is a professor of journalism at Mount Holyoke College. She's a former medical writer for the Boston Globe and is a Pulitzer-nominated journalist. She's the author of Side Effects, a prosecutor, a whistleblower, and a best-selling antidepressant on trial about GlaxoSmithKline and Paxil. Thank you for joining us today on Madness Radio, Alison Bass.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Your book is getting a lot of really good reviews, and I would recommend it for people both who are interested in antidepressants and policy and legal issues, but especially just it's a good read. It's definitely more like a crime thriller, the way in which you were able to dig into the facts behind corruption around Paxil and antidepressant clinical research. Tell us how you got interested in this. How did you first get connected to the case and get involved and then end up writing the book?
Well, I was a longtime mental health reporter for the Boston Globe, and in the mid-'90s I received an anonymous phone call from a woman, and when I returned the call, she said she was an assistant research administrator at Brown University and that she had in her possessions documents showing that the department was misrepresenting data on 2 clinical trials, one of which involved Paxil for the treatment of depression in adolescents. And she had a number of other allegations to share with me as well. And I met with her and saw the documents and interviewed a lot of people and ended up writing a series of articles in the Boston Globe about Dr. Martin Keller and the shenanigans in billing and research in his Department of Psychiatry at Brown. But I wasn't able to pin down the allegations about the Paxil clinical trial. And it wasn't until 9 years later when the New York State Attorney General's office sued GlaxoSmithKline for basically deceiving patients and doctors about the safety and effectiveness of Paxil that I put the two together and realized I remembered what Donna Howard, the assistant research administrator at Brown, had told me almost 9 years prior. And I quickly found out that the brainchild behind the state attorney general's lawsuit was another woman by the name of Rose Firestein, an assistant attorney general, and started talking to her, and I realized there was a great story here because we had the story of 2 women who were basically exposing the deception behind the making of this best-selling drug Paxil. And Rose Firestein had found that basically GlaxoSmithKline had withheld negative findings about Paxil. Not only that it wasn't effective, it was no more effective than a placebo or a sugar pill in treating adolescents and children for depression, but that it also increased the risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors in some children and adolescents. And this information was suppressed during the 90s by GlaxoSmithKline, and that's why they sued GlaxoSmithKline.
So you were contacted in the 90s by this whistleblower,
Yes.
and then it was basically later that kind of more information came to light, and the lawsuit from the New York Attorney General created a context for you to connect the whistleblower with that case and get that information out. Now tell us a little bit about GlaxoSmithKline and Paxil, because we're talking about billions of dollars that are at stake here. This is one of the most successful pills that's in the market, and Glaxo, like other pharmaceutical companies, really rely on these blockbuster medications, these blockbuster products for their profits.
Well, that's right. I mean, all of the antidepressants, including Paxil, Prozac, Zoloft, Celexa, they're still among the top 5 classes of drugs sold in the United States today, and they have been blockbuster drugs since the early 90s. And the reason why they sell so much is because even they were approved by the FDA in the late 80s, early 90s, just for the treatment of depression in adults. But GlaxoSmithKline began, and other makers of these antidepressants, convinced doctors to prescribe these drugs off-label for unapproved uses in children and adolescents, and also for other unapproved conditions. And they did so by funding these clinical trials in which data was misrepresented and hid. In other words, there were a number of clinical trials that found that these drugs were no more effective than a placebo in treating children and adolescents, but they never published those trials. Instead, they published only those trials which purported to show that these antidepressants were effective. And they also, in those trials, they suppressed information about the increased risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So they basically deceived the American public about the safety and effectiveness of these antidepressants. And it wasn't until the Attorney General's office in New York sued GlaxoSmithKline and settled the case that this got a lot of publicity, and people began to be aware, and prescribing doctors began to be aware that these drugs were not as safe or effective as the drug companies said they were.
So the action by the New York Attorney General's office was really kind of the turning point in the public perception of antidepressants. I mean, today we have these black box warnings, but people should remember that before all of this happened, there was kind of this sort of miracle drug aura around the antidepressants. It still exists to some degree, but that's been tarnished somewhat. But the idea that these drugs could be actually leading to suicidal thoughts, or that there actually could be corruption going on, or that the science wasn't sound, these were all new ideas that hadn't been accepted until this landmark lawsuit started to gain ground and become successful from the New York Attorney General.
That's exactly right. And it wasn't until after the New York Attorney General's office sued GlaxoSmithKline that the FDA finally put black box warnings on these drugs, saying that they did increase the risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors in children, and then they later put the same black box warnings on for young adults, that there is this increased risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors among young adults taking the antidepressants as well. So there was it wasn't until all this happened that people became aware that the miracle drugs, the wonder drugs of the 90s were not so, in fact, wonderful.
And that's a really disturbing fact about antidepressants, because it's one thing to say, okay, they don't work any better than a placebo, than a sugar pill, but it's another thing to say they don't work any better than a placebo and a sugar pill, and they can cause the very problem that they're prescribed for, which is that these are antidepressants, so we're dealing with depression, and often people have suicidal thoughts, and the antidepressants are seen as kind of anti-suicide treatment. They're seen as a response to help people who might be at risk of suicide, and that's one of the things that's most shocking about these the medications, that the actual way in which they can lead to suicide and suicidal thoughts was something that was suppressed by the research in the way that your book talks about.
That's right. I mean, I want to just stress that for some people, these drugs do help lift the fog of depression, particularly for older adults. Like I said, they haven't been found to be effective in children and adolescents, but for adults older than 25, there is clinical trial research showing that they are more effective than a placebo, and they have helped people. But everybody's brain metabolism is different, and in some people, they actually increase the risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors.
Well, hasn't there also been research around Prozac and the way in which it was exaggerated?
It's true. I mean, I focused on Paxil, but in my book I talk about Prozac and Zoloft and the other what are known as SSRI antidepressants for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So that's Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa, and some other drugs. They all increase the risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors in some people, and they are not, except for Prozac, none of them have been found to be at all effective in children and adolescents. And even the studies done on Prozac are under dispute right now. So it's all of the antidepressants, and there's evidence that the makers of these other antidepressants also suppressed negative findings about their drugs.
What was it that motivated the New York Attorney General to start going after the corruption at GlaxoSmithKline with these studies?
Well, that's a really good question, because up until then, they really hadn't taken on the pharmaceutical industry in terms of defrauding patients and consumers. It was because of this woman, Rose Firestein, very maverick, unusual newcomer to the Attorney General's office. She had worked, before she came to the Attorney General's office, she had worked for first Legal Aid and then a national rights organization that tried to protect people, youngsters who are in foster care, who weren't getting the attention and care they needed, and were being neglected and abused in the foster care system. And she had discovered, and others had discovered as well, and they were suing state DSS, state foster care systems, because these youngsters were also being over-medicated on very powerful psychoactive drugs like Risperdal, Seroquel, Zyprexa, and Paxil, Prozac, and Zoloft. And so she became aware that these drugs were being overprescribed for this very vulnerable foster care population. And they sued a number of, she helped a number of people sue the state foster care systems because of this problem. And then she came to the Attorney General's office and she wanted to look into this because she felt that doctors were not getting the full story about these drugs. But it was because of her unusual background that she basically talked her bosses into letting her look into this, and came up with the fact that GlaxoSmithKline was selectively publishing only positive, what purported to be positive findings about Paxil, and suppressing the negative findings. She also discovered that the one study that was purported to show a positive result was in fact didn't. That the data did not represent what they were saying, their claims. And this is a Paxil study that I looked into in further depth, and in which I found that there was actually skewing of data to make Paxil look more effective and safer than it really was. And this was the study that was spearheaded by Marty Keller at Brown, which Donna Howard had told me about all those years ago. So all the pieces began to fit together, and I realized there was a great story here.
So with the situation in foster care homes, essentially what you have is a product, psychiatric medication, whether it's antidepressants or antipsychotics, that there's so much hype and there's so much positive advertising and there's so much promotional publicity going on that it very, very quickly moves into dangerous abuse.
What Rose found out was that people were using these drugs as kind of chemical straitjackets to control their behavior when they acted out under perfectly legitimate situations. I mean, you know, if you were being neglected and abused, you'd act out too. And the sad thing is that it's cheaper for doctors to prescribe a powerful psychoactive drug than to ensure that these kids get the kind of help, therapeutic help they need.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the calculation is cheaper maybe in the short run, but in the long run, you end up having, you know, greater dependence on the system and maybe more hospitalizations or that kind of thing, but that's not figured in the short-term calculation.
True.
And it parallels with the situation in nursing homes where, again, you have this huge use of psychiatric drugs basically as a control tool to keep people quiet and to make them more manageable. And it is a quick fix that's used as a short-term way of saving money that creates longer-term problems. Now Rose Firestein, she was very interested in the foster care situation. What did she have any personal connection with that issue, or what is it? How did she get involved with that herself?
She worked for an organization called National Children's Rights. And they are a national organization that comes in and provides legal help to people in various states who are trying to make things better for children, particularly vulnerable children like those who are in foster care. So she just ended up on some of these cases and helping, and she would take affidavits from some of these foster care these children in foster care who were being over-medicated, and it really opened her eyes to the dangers of these drugs and how they were being overutilized. And this is still going on. There's a big case going on in Florida where a 7-year-old boy hung himself after being overprescribed. I think it was one of the antipsychotics, Zyprexa or Seroquel. And this keeps happening where doctors who really don't know about these children and don't care are just prescribing drugs to work as chemical straitjackets. So it's still going on. She was among the first to bring it to the public eye.
So she went to work for the New York State Attorney General's office, which at the time the State Attorney General was Eliot Spitzer, who was really someone who was a maverick and was very much challenging corporate interests, banking interests, Wall Street interests, as well as the pharmaceutical companies. So that created an opportunity for her to pursue her research and to investigate further what was going on.
That's exactly right. I mean, Eliot Spitzer was one of the first New York Attorney General's office who really took on big corporate interests for the little guy, and he had taken on Wall Street, Merrill Lynch for the conflicts of interest in the fact that they were not disclosing their conflicts to stockholders. That's a long, complicated story, but basically there was a lot of corruption going on, and people who owned stock were getting taken advantage of because they didn't realize that the banks were touting stocks that they also owned, and they were not disclosing these conflicts, so people would invest in stocks, and it turns out the stocks were no good. So he took them on, and then he was interested in also some of these conflicts of interest in the pharmaceutical industry. And then when Rose came on, their interests dovetailed, and Rose talked her bosses and Eliot Spitzer into suing GlaxoSmithKline because she had found, as I said before, that they were withholding negative findings and they were defrauding the American public. And what was so interesting is that she was the one who came up with the idea of using New York's consumer fraud statute to sue GlaxoSmithKline. That had never been done before, and it is now being done by many other state attorney generals' offices and the federal prosecutors who are saying, you are defrauding consumers when you suppress negative information about drugs.
And that's been especially around the Medicaid billing, the way in which state Medicaid has been frauded by the atypical antipsychotics. Is that right?
Exactly. That's right. So they're taking a page from Rose Firestein's book in suing antipsychotic makers who, again, suppress negative findings about these antipsychotics like Seroquel, Zyprexa, Risperdal. That's right.
So your book, Side Effects, A Prosecutor, a Whistleblower, and a Bestselling Antidepressant on Trial, really chronicles, it looks at the turning point when suddenly the situation is kind of blown wide open with exposure of pharmaceutical company corruption and conflict of interest. And a lot of what we're seeing today with the Grassley hearings, with the conflict of interest investigative reporting that's going on, really started with this issue of Paxil, GlaxoSmithKline, and Rose Firestein's work with the Attorney General of New York's lawsuit.
That's right. I mean, in fact, Grassley's aides, I had sent my book to them in the spring of last year, so that may have propelled some of their interest in doing these conflict of interest investigations, and they've done a fine job in terms of exposing doctors who are on the take from drug companies and who have not disclosed their conflicts to their universities and to the National Institutes of Health. And the problem is these are the doctors that are doing the research on these drugs. So they're getting hundreds of thousands of dollars, in some cases millions of dollars, from the drug companies. At the same time, they're publishing research touting these companies' drugs. And that's a blatant conflict of interest and needs to be disclosed. In fact, I would argue that these particular medical researchers who are on the take should not be allowed to do research and publish research about the drugs being made by companies who are giving them money on the side. That's simply not, there's a lot of research that shows that getting a lot of money, getting any kind of money, skews people's judgment and makes them want to do favors for the person who's giving them the money, and it shouldn't be allowed.
And these are not just researchers that are here and there, sort of in the corners and nooks and crannies of research institutions and universities, these are actually the most prominent psychiatrists in the country and in the world that we're talking about. I mean, Martin Keller, the chair of psychiatry at Brown University, that's one of the most prestigious universities around, and this is kind of the gold standard for what good science and good research is supposed to be. And what's happened since the investigations from the New York State Attorney General's office and the lawsuit successful against GlaxoSmithKline is that really the climate has really changed somewhat in the U.S. We're seeing much, much more, almost on a weekly basis, we're seeing things in the media about these issues and about the conflicts of interest and about the corruption in pharmaceutical drug trials and psychiatric drugs. And before, I remember when Freedom Center got started in 2001, we were talking about these issues, but it just hadn't broken into the public consciousness, and it hadn't really reached that point of taking off and having more mainstream investigations going on and broader public attention. And so your book really talks about that moment in history when that change took place. Let's talk about the trial itself, because you get into a lot of detail with what happened and how the lawyers for GlaxoSmithKline tried to just do everything that they could to make sure that they didn't lose that case and that this information about their fraud didn't come out. What were some of the highlights of the trial itself?
What happened is that they sued GlaxoSmithKline, and GlaxoSmithKline in federal court, and GlaxoSmithKline attorneys tried to get it thrown out several times. They argued that it didn't that the FDA had jurisdiction here. Because the FDA approved drugs, and that therefore the New York State Attorney General's office couldn't be suing GlaxoSmithKline because the FDA had jurisdiction. But as it turned out, I mean, New York State is the one who licenses doctors to perform medicine. And what Rose Firestein and her colleagues were arguing is that by suppressing negative information about these drugs, doctors cannot perform their duties as doctors because they don't have the full story. So it's very much the purview of the states to be involved, to make sure doctors can prescribe drugs and in a informed, appropriate way. So she kept it from being thrown out in federal court, and it became clear that they had a really good case, the New York Attorney General's office had a really good case, and that it was a case of consumer fraud. So GlaxoSmithKline felt that they better settle, or it could be far worse if they kept fighting it. Damages would go up, it would get more expensive, and they didn't want to lose the case. So they ended up settling it the end of the summer of 2004, and in return they paid I think it was a $4 million or $5 million fine. They also, and this is even more important, they agreed to post the results of all their clinical trials on a publicly available website, not just the positive findings, but all of them. And this led to a law in Congress requiring all drug companies to post all of their results, not just the positive findings. And so that was a really important first step toward transparency and full disclosure. The problem with that is that most people get their information from journalists who get their information from medical journals, and that's where most doctors get their information. And medical journals still don't publish as many. They're much more likely to publish positive findings, and drug companies don't want the negative findings published, so they don't submit them to the journals. So you're still not getting the full story about new drugs. And this is not just with the antidepressants. This happened with Vioxx, where the negative findings about Vioxx, its increased risk of causing heart attacks in many people, were not disclosed in the medical journals. It's happened with Avandia, an anti-diabetes drug, Procrit, an anti-anemia drug, Vytorin, an anti-cholesterol drug. So this keeps going on, where the full story about the safety and effectiveness of new drugs is not disclosed to the American public. But there have been some very important first steps towards reform.
Well, you mentioned the settlement of around $5 million, and what it seems like is happening, because there have been other settlements with, there was a big settlement around Zyprexa with Eli Lilly, and it seems like what's happening is that if these results and if the litigation can be delayed and if the settlements can actually be relatively small compared to the billions of dollars of profit that are being made. It seems like what's happening is that the risks of being exposed and litigation have been kind of incorporated almost into the product cycle itself, because now that we've got these antidepressants, the SSRIs, that their reputation is kind of going down, there's research and then there's new drugs that are coming out, and kind of the process sort of starts all over again. I mean, that's sort of what happened with the atypicals, was that they were originally touted as being these miracle alternatives to the earlier, older drugs. They were supposed to be more effective and safer, and then that gets exposed. But then there are newer drugs that are coming down the line. So in a sense, even though the information is coming out, even though the litigation is successful, the impact on the industry is kind of minimal in some ways.
Well, it's true that, I mean, because of the success of the New York State Attorney General's lawsuit and others like it, federal prosecutors, particularly now that with the Obama administration, they're getting more aggressive in going after the pharmaceutical companies for defrauding people, and they're assigning much more much higher fines. Like the Cyprexa fine was, I'm trying to think, it was hundreds of millions of dollars against Eli Lilly, and so that does have impact. And they're continuing to sue. Federal prosecutors are suing other antidepressant makers and other makers of antipsychotics, and so that will take a toll. And so pharmaceutical companies are being forced. They're being forced to disclose all of the results and to not defraud people with just half the story. So, I mean, there is some impact where I think pharmaceutical companies are more careful not to, hype the medications and, to tell the full story. But you're absolutely right that there's new drugs coming on, and that they're still not publishing the negative findings that they get. They only publish the positive findings. So that still continues. And it remains a problem. I mean, there's a legislation that's been proposed that would, that's actually in the current healthcare reform bill, that would require drug companies to disclose all payments they make to doctors and medical researchers, so that the American public know where there's a conflict of interest, and so that they know if they go to a doctor who, hands out an antipsychotic or an antidepressant, they can look up and see, oh, well, this guy got, $100,000 from the maker of the drug that he's prescribing. I'm not sure I trust him. I'm going to go to somebody else. So there is, if this law gets passed, that will be a big step forward towards transparency, so that the American public is more aware of where these conflicts of interest reside, and of where the pharmaceutical companies are not telling the full story.
If you were just joining us, this is Madness Radio, and our guest today is Alison Bass. She's a Pulitzer-nominated journalist and professor of journalism at Mount Holyoke College, and she's the author of Side Effects, A Prosecutor, a Whistleblower, and a Best-Selling Antidepressant on Trial. Where do you think changes might take place with the scientific research? Because we're talking about a lot of studies that get published that are basically ghostwritten by pharmaceutical companies, and a lot of the research that claims to be suggesting scientific effectiveness and medical usefulness of medications is actually public relations tool of the pharmaceutical industry, and that doctors are kind of relying on what they think is science, but is actually marketing to form an impression about the products that they're providing to their patients. Right.
Well, I think what needs to happen is that the medical centers, the places where this research takes place, need to stiffen their conflict of interest policies and say to doctors, if you are getting a certain amount of money, above a certain amount of money, $10,000, $20,000 from a drug company, you cannot do research on their drugs. That's a conflict. And they're also requiring them to disclose the money they get, so that they will know if someone's making a whole lot of money from a particular drug company, because that then taints their objectivity when they do research on these drugs. So those policies are very important. In addition, Senator Grassley's team has been putting pressure on the National Institutes of Health to enforce its own conflict of interest policies, which, by the way, has been on the books since 1995, but they never enforced it. basically would give all this lucrative research funding to doctors who had these conflicts, and they didn't care, they didn't know, they didn't care if they weren't disclosing this conflict of interest to them. But because of the pressure being put on NIH by Congress, they are being more careful about not giving research funding to tainted doctors and medical researchers. So that's really important, and that pressure has to continue.
One of the interesting aspects of this is that it's coming out of the New York Attorney General's office, and the New York Attorney General was Eliot Spitzer, who, as we know, went down in a scandal. He was paying for prostitutes, and this became publicized, and then he was forced to resign in disgrace. And it seems like there's a little bit more to that story than just a stupid man who gets caught doing something bad. That actually he had alienated a lot of very powerful interests and made a lot of enemies. And do you think that played a role in his downfall?
Yes, I do. I think that the Republican administration, this was at the time when the Bush administration was still in power, and there were a lot of very powerful conservative interests that were very angry at Spitzer because he had taken on not only the pharmaceutical industry but Wall Street and all the banks. And it was one of those banks that tipped off the Department of Justice, someone in the Department of Justice, that there was these unusual electronic money transfers from Spitzer, and that they traced it to a escort service. So if it had been somebody else, they probably would never have investigated. But they were interested in taking him down. Now, Spitzer was incredibly stupid to A, go to a prostitute, and B, being a married man, and B, paying for it through electronic money transfers that can be traced by banks. Be that as it may, if he had been someone other than who he was, I doubt they would have ever investigated it.
Because there are plenty of politicians, Republicans as well as Democrats, who go to escort services, and there are plenty of banks that notice unusual activity on electronic fund transfers, and then they just don't report it or they don't do anything. And here comes along somebody who's prominent and has a lot of enemies, and they decide to do something about it.
That's right. That's my speculation.
One of the things that's interesting about your book is that you mention that these drugs aren't just marketed in the U.S., they're marketed in Europe as well. And it sounds like the European regulatory agencies were much more on the ball and got, for example, the suicide warning put on antidepressant packages and labels long before it was in the United States. What's your sense of that, and how the international regulation is different than the U.S. regulation?
Well, there are certain countries in Europe that are more stringent, but it's not always the case that all of them are, and in some cases they're laxer. In Germany, for instance, they found evidence that there was evidence from very early studies of Prozac in Germany that it increased the risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors in adults. So Germany refused to approve Prozac for many years. And then when it did so, it said, well, you also have to give them, if you're going to give them Prozac, you also have to give them a kind of Valium-like pill so that it would reduce the jitteriness, the sense of feeling like you're going to jump out of your skin that often leads people to want to kill themselves. So Germany was being more stringent. However, a lot of other countries weren't, and it was only a year or two before the FDA put their black box warnings on that the English equivalent to the FDA did the same. They did take the lead here in terms of banning the use of Paxil and some of the other SSRI antidepressants for use in children and adolescents. They actually did take a stronger stand than the FDA, and they did it about a year or two before. But it wasn't until the New York State Attorney General's office sued GlaxoSmithKline. I think it was the same. They sued in June 2004, and I think it was the same month that the English regulatory body said that they were looking into Paxil as well. And then in that December, they actually banned the use of these antidepressants for children and adolescents. So it was all happening around the same time, and so that they weren't that ahead of the curve in England. So it depends. In the 1960s, the FDA was was more stringent than some of the English regulatory agencies, and that's what kept thalidomide, that drug that pregnant women were being given and that produced birth defects. The FDA, that was approved for use in several European countries, but the FDA said no. We're not sure about it. We're not approving it. So it did protect women in the United States. But in the 1980s and 90s, as I write about in my book, first the Reagan administration and then the first Bush administration gutted the FDA. They gutted the resources of this regulatory body, and they didn't have the money to do the kind of vetting of new drugs that they needed. And that's when drug approvals started speeding up, and they began to get more money from the drug industry in user fees to fund their work, and that led to a sense that the FDA was beholden to the very industry that it was supposed to regulate.
And that's a deregulation story that we see in banking, in the housing market, and in environmental issues around polluting industries and medicine in general. It's just a very striking impact that the Reagan era kind of kicked off with a lot of the protections of the public just being undermined, and we're still seeing the effects of that. We've been talking a lot about Paxil, and especially the way in which it isn't as effective as it's claimed to be, and also the dangers of increasing suicide. And one of the things about Paxil too, and I think this should be talked about, is that the addiction issues with Paxil when it was first marketed. There wasn't any recognized real problems withdrawing. It wasn't considered a dependency-creating drug. But so many people that I've talked to, and this has become much more widely known, have extremely difficult times coming off of Paxil. It's sort of notorious for causing just horrendous withdrawal effects when people try and come off of it, like electrical jolts to the brain. And that's something that's also been suppressed, and now it's coming more to light. And has the investigations that you're writing about, have that played a role in that?
Not on the withdrawal part, but actually, you're absolutely right. It has a terrible, people trying to withdraw from Paxil have a terrible time and often can't get off the drug as a result. And that sometimes the withdrawal itself makes people suicidal. What really made the difference with the withdrawal is that a number of plaintiffs sued GlaxoSmithKline. It became a class action suit, and I think that came out. I mean, there was a portion of that in Rose Firestein's lawsuit, but it was the role of litigators, of civil litigators, that got that out to the public about the withdrawal problems.
And I think the door was open to that litigation by this groundbreaking work that the New York State Attorney General office did.
Yep. That definitely, and the fact that they proved that you could prove that you could use a consumer fraud statute to sue drug companies. So yes, it was definitely instrumental in giving plaintiff attorneys the courage to go after drug companies. So that's very true.
Something you also talk about in the book is the way in which patient advocacy groups, especially NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, have been so manipulated to become marketing arms of pharmaceutical companies. Tell us a little bit about that and how it plays a role here with Paxil and GlaxoSmithKline.
Well, basically the same source, Donna Howard, who worked at Brown, went to work for the Rhode Island chapter of NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, and she discovered that the president of NAMI, of the national NAMI, was laundering money, was getting money from the drug companies to speak on behalf of their products, the antidepressants, because he himself was suffered from depression and had taken some of these drugs. But he failed to disclose the fact that he was getting all this money from drug companies when he talked about how wonderful their drugs were. And not only that, but he would launder the money through the local Rhode Island chapter where Donna worked, so that it didn't look like the money was coming directly to him. Instead, it went to the NAMI chapter, and the NAMI chapter there would write a check to this guy. So, and Donna also told me about, and it's still going on today, that NAMI gets a lot of its money from drug companies. so that it's not a particularly impartial source when it talks about how wonderful some of these powerful psychotic drugs are. They're incredibly well funded by the pharmaceutical industry and continue to be.
I think the Grassley hearings brought out that NAMI receives something like 56% of its national budget from pharmaceutical company
That's right.
funding.
That at least was what I found in my book between 2002 and 2004 when they published their annual reports, that they were getting more than half of their entire budget was coming from the pharmaceutical companies.
And this is just what we know about, because it's been there's an article, investigative piece that was done in Mother Jones magazine many years ago, and it's been known, especially in the consumer survivor movement, that NAMI is completely tainted by this conflict of interest, receiving lots of pharmaceutical company funding. But we had no idea that it was so huge, that it was 56%, and that's only what we know so far. There could be other ways in which there's conflict of interest going on and manipulation going on. So you're saying that the head of NAMI was essentially a paid drug company marketing representative and wasn't revealing that to anyone, while they are presenting themselves as a successful survivor story of how wonderful the drugs are and how I was able to recover as a result of these great products, but also not saying that I'm actually being paid to say this by the manufacturer of the product.
Well, that's right. Jim McNulty, who was president of the national organization of NAMI from 2002 to 2004, that's exactly what was going on. And I'm sure he's not the only one. He's just the one that I wrote about. And it's a crying shame, because NAMI bills itself as the largest advocacy organization for people with mental illness and for their families. And these people should, they expect an impartial point of view. They expect a nonpartisan opinion from the people who are leading them. What they don't expect is someone who's on the take and not revealing it.
And NAMI, we should remember, is the most prominent patient advocacy group around mental health. I mean, they are the group that everyone goes to: law enforcement, state, federal, politicians, journalists. When they want the sort of the perspective of the consumers, they are the prominent leading organization that is turned to. And I think hopefully that's changing somewhat. But basically what it means is that you get a closed loop with no one who's really able to criticize pharmaceutical companies and mainstream treatments and the assumptions behind the science. No one is able to really get into the public discourse, because the representation from the consumer side is already covered by this organization that is basically fronting for pharmaceutical company interests. And it reminds me, there's actually a very prominent patient advocate, consumer survivor advocate in Massachusetts, who let out that he had actually been on a cruise, that there was a cruise ship that was paid for by some pharmaceutical company. It sounds pretty wild, but they actually do this as part of their marketing, that they put people on cruises. And that was something that they had done. And this is a very pro-medication advocate in Massachusetts, who again is considered one of the most prominent people that the media go to, and is sitting on committees and in hearings before. And then if you look at actually NAMI's policies, I mean, it's very much couched, of course, in how do we get better treatment and how do we help people the best way that we can. And there are some good things that they do. They promote funding for services and homeless agencies, and they're often on the right side of a lot of issues. But throughout their policy is this constant assumption that the medications are needed, they're necessary, they're effective. That's what we have. Let's get more people on the medications. Let's force people on medications even. It's ironic that in the expose of the pharmaceutical drugs that have come out in the last several years, that the leading consumer organization hasn't played a role in that at all. They've actually been completely behind the curve on it. They haven't been leading the charge or saying much of anything. And here's why. It's because they're actually getting funded by those very same interests.
That's very true. Absolutely. Yeah.
Alison, tell us about how the reviews have been for the book.
Well, the book has gotten really good reviews in USA Today, the Boston Globe, New York Review of Books, the Washington Post called it long-form journalism at its best. Even medical journals like the New England Journal of Medicine and medical blogs said that one medical blogger said that it read like a John Grisham thriller, but told you everything you needed to know about how the pharmaceutical companies lie about science. And it recently had a great review in Nature Medicine, and even the American Journal of Psychiatry weighed in with a good review in April. What's interesting, though, and this is how I think the pharmaceutical industry tries to squelch the book, in the very early days, there was an review in the Wall Street Journal by a guy who turns out was a defense attorney who works for the drug companies. In other words, he defends them against product liability lawsuits, the kind of lawsuits that I write about in the book. And that was just very inappropriate. The Wall Street Journal should not have turned to a clearly biased source to write a review, and of course he panned the book. But like I said before, most of the reviews have been very positive.
And what about the response? I think that the pharmaceutical companies, one of the things that they did when the black box warnings were actually put into effect was that they came back with this argument that says, well, the suicide rates are going to go up because people are using less antidepressants because they're scared to use them, or doctors are scared to prescribe them. And actually, this is sort of counterproductive from a patient standpoint because we're dissuading people from actually getting the treatment and the help that they need. And that has been sort of the standard response that the drug companies have been putting out to a lot of this regulation. So what do you make of that?
Well, there is no evidence currently of a link between the FDA black box warnings and an uptick in youth suicide rates in 2004 and 2005. So that's a spurious conclusion, but it's not really happening. I mean, there have been, like I said, the antidepressants are still among the top 5 classes of drugs sold in the United States today. There may be some fewer prescriptions for children, particularly young children, which I think is all to the good. But like I said, there is no evidence that there is a connection between the black box warnings and an increase in suicide rates. So that's a spurious claim. There has been no connection.
But there has been some increase in suicide rates according to some research, but there are other reasons why that could be other than people aren't taking their medications.
Well, see, there was a slight uptick in suicide rates between 2003 and 2004, but that's before the black box warnings went into effect. So you cannot attribute them to the black box warnings. And that's where their claim goes awry. And
there have been a number of articles in mainstream magazines really kind of sounding an alarm around suicide rates, and especially around college suicide and youth suicide. And that seems very tied into the pharmaceutical marketing, because the push is, well, we have to get people treatment. These are people who are in trouble and they're not getting treatment, they're not getting help. And of course, then there's this equation between help, treatment, and medications. And so it seems like the marketing is really tied into a lot of the public awareness of suicide.
Right. And, in fact, there was an analysis published in the Journal of the American Medical Association last fall that found that the rate of suicides among youth aged 10 to 19 actually fell by 5.3% between 2004 and 2005. So again, that puts to, that basically belies the claims that there's an increase in suicide rates, because there's not. And they're not tied to the FDA black box warnings at all.
And I know with the Vioxx scandal, we do have a sense of the number of people, tens of thousands of people who died. Has there been any research or any estimates that you know of the actual impact that antidepressant use and the suicides that could be related to antidepressant use has actually had on society?
Well, there is clinical research that shows that in the case of Paxil, there is a 5-fold increase in the risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors among patients taking Paxil versus those taking placebo. And that's from the clinical trial results themselves. Okay, a 5-fold increase in the risk of suicidal ideation, thoughts, and behaviors. And then, of course, there's a lot of anecdotal information out there about people who committed suicide after taking the drugs.
So we could be talking about tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, I don't know what I don't think anybody's actually done a study that links actual suicides to the antidepressants, because first of all, that's the kind of the drug companies would not benefit from a study, so they're not going to fund such a study, and that's who's going to do it. I mean, right now those kind of clinical trial studies are done by the drug companies, and they're supposed to be done by the drug companies. In fact, the FDA says you have to do these kind of safety studies once the drug is approved, but they don't do them. Because it doesn't behoove to their interest to come up with studies that show that there are bad side effects. So they don't do these studies, and no one else does them. So a definitive study has not been done.
Alison, we are just about out of time. You have a blog, and why don't you give us the web address for that, and also tell us about your book again?
Okay. Well, my website and blog address is www.alison-bass.com, and you can find on that website all the reviews that have been done about my book, Side Effects, a Prosecutor, a Whistleblower, and a Bestselling Antidepressant on Trial, along with my regular blog in which I talk about important issues in healthcare and discuss the flaws in our current system of drug research and development.
And I think you recently did a little profile on your blog of the Freedom Center interviewing Katie Simon.
That's right, because the work you do is very important and very helpful to people with mental illness.
Well, thanks a lot, Alison. It's been great having you on Madness Radio.
It's been my pleasure too, Will.
You've been listening to an interview with Alison Bass. Alison is a professor of journalism at Mount Holyoke College. She's a former medical writer for Boston Globe newspaper and is a Pulitzer-nominated journalist. Her book is called Side Effects, a Prosecutor, a Whistleblower, and a Best-Selling Antidepressant on Trial. And you can get in touch with her and find out more at her website, including reading her blog, which is at www.alison-bass.com. That's about all the time we have on Madness Radio. Thanks a lot for tuning in. You've been listening to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Madness Radio broadcasts every Tuesday, 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern, on Pacifica affiliates WXOJ LP-FM, Northampton, Massachusetts, and KWMD, Kasilof and Anchorage, Alaska. Co-produced by peer-run mental health communities freedom-center.org and theicarusproject.net. Madness Radio is hosted by Will Hall. Music producer is John Rice, with technical assistance from Jeremy Landsman. Listen to our internet stream, podcasts, and show archives at madnessradio.net. If you have an idea for a story or guest on Madness Radio, to help get us broadcast on a station near you, or if you just want to share what's in your head, contact radio@madnessradio.net.